All right, so are you ready to kind of dig into a side of Texas history,
Yeah.
that you probably won't find in like your typical textbook?
Yeah.
We're really going to take a deep dive into the road to Texas independence,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
specifically how this whole issue of slavery,
Right.
shaped those events.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're really going beyond the Alamo,
All right.
going beyond those kind of battles and the iconic stories
Right.
to uncover some of those lesser known stories and perspectives.
Okay.
And we're using Jorge Majfud's The Wild Frontier as our guide for this.
I like it. So put on your historian hats, everybody.
Yeah.
Because things are about to get really interesting.
Right.
We're starting our journey in the 1820s.
Okay.
A time when Mexico was, fresh off its independence from Spain.
Right.
And really eager to kind of establish itself, as its own nation.
Absolutely. And they saw Texas as really key to that plan. You have this vast territory.
Okay.
Sparsely populated, full of potential, but it needed something, and it needed settlers.
It needed people. Yeah.
Enter the Anglo-American.
Right, exactly. And the Mexican government was like, hey, come on in.
Yeah.
Welcome, welcome. They offered these incredibly generous land grants
Yeah.
to anyone willing to, make the trek and cultivate the land.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine being offered 4,400 acres
It's a lot of land.
just to start a farm?
It's unbelievable.
That's like, being handed the keys to a small country.
Right, exactly. It's amazing. And it was a really enticing offer for a lot of people, especially those who are looking for a fresh start,
Sure.
And for an example, you can think about someone like Jared Gross. In 1822, he crosses into Texas with 90 slaves and 40 wagons loaded with supplies.
Wow. That's a lot.
This wasn't just a family moving. This was like a large-scale
Yeah.
agricultural operation in the making.
Talk about going all in. But wait, I have to ask, 90 slaves. Didn't Mexico, abolish slavery?
They did. And that's where, this is where the story gets a little bit more complicated.
Okay.
You see, while Mexico was welcoming these settlers with open arms, kind of had this open door policy,
Right.
this fundamental ideological clash was brewing.
Okay.
Because Mexico had built its newly independent nation on these principles of racial equality.
Okay.
Which, stood in stark contrast to the United States, where slavery was very much entrenched at the time.
So you have these escaped slaves fleeing north to Mexico.
Right.
Seeking refuge.
That's right.
Seeking freedom.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have these slave owners heading south to expand the very system they were escaping.
That's right.
Talk about setting the stage for some serious tension.
Absolutely. And at the heart of all of this was Stephen Austin,
Okay.
who's often hailed as the father of Texas.
Right.
He was a, really shrewd businessman,
Okay.
secured massive land grants from the Mexican government, right? Promising to bring in all these settlers, to cultivate the land.
Right.
But Austin, like many Anglo-Americans, saw slavery as essential to their success.
So this wasn't just a difference of opinion.
No.
This was a direct challenge to Mexican law.
Exactly.
And their authority.
And we see this clash play out in the anxieties of the settlers themselves.
Okay.
We see letters from this period, for instance, there's one from George Nixon to Austin, reveals this growing concern
Okay.
that, cellular rumors were swirling that Mexico might actually enforce its ban on slavery.
So the alarm bells are starting to go off.
Yeah.
These settlers are realizing, Mexico may not be so keen on just turning a blind eye to this peculiar institution, as they like to call it.
And their response, double down.
Really?
Yeah, they double down. In their petitions to the Mexican government, they don't just ask for an exception. They argue that slaves were necessary property, vital to their very survival in this new land.
Wow. So much for trying to assimilate to their new home.
Right.
They're basically demanding that Mexico change its laws to accommodate their way of life.
It's a classic example of settlers imposing their will on native populations.
Yeah.
This sense of entitlement overriding any respect for the existing laws and customs.
Wow. And it's a pattern that, unfortunately, we've seen repeated throughout history.
Yeah, that's an unfortunate pattern.
And Austin, he wasn't exactly playing the role of peacemaker here, was he?
No, not at all.
I mean, he actually argued that forbidding slavery was inhumane.
He did?
What was he thinking?
Well, Austin, like many slave owners, relied on this web of justifications that seem,
Sure.
they're cloaked in this language that seems very absurd to us today, right?
Yeah.
So he argued that prohibiting slavery was inhumane because it deprived enslaved people of the opportunity to learn work skills.
Hold on, let me get this straight.
Sure.
He's claiming that being enslaved was a good thing for the people being enslaved.
Yes.
That's a whole other level. Yes.
It is, but that was a common refrain in pro-slavery rhetoric.
Oh, wow.
They're framing it as a form of education, civilizing, right? This allowed them to rationalize the exploitation
Right.
and maintain a system that was built on dehumanization of an entire race.
It's chilling to see how ingrained these justifications were.
Yeah.
But this kind of begs the question, how did the Mexican government react to this, blatant defiance?
Yeah.
Were they just letting it slide?
Well, at first they tried to find the middle ground,
Okay.
a way to balance their ideals with,
Yeah.
the reality on the ground.
Sure.
But as you'll see, that delicate dance couldn't last forever.
So Mexico is trying to, walk this tightrope,
Right.
between attracting settlers and upholding its own laws against slavery. How'd that go?
Yeah, predictably, it was just a recipe for more tension.
Yeah.
And we see, newspapers in the U.S. reflecting the anxieties at the time.
Okay.
They begin to openly discuss this possibility of Texas independence and this idea of a, beleaguered group of settlers
Right.
stifled by an oppressive government. It starts to gain a lot of traction.
But wasn't that a little bit of a stretch? They were getting massive land grants.
It is, and it's a classic example of how these narratives get spun, how history gets written by the victors, right? Remember, for many of these Anglo-American settlers, their vision of Texas was one very much steeped in slavery.
Okay.
Regardless of what Mexican law stated,
Right.
they saw it as intertwined with their economic survival, with their dreams of prosperity.
And any attempt by Mexico to kind of assert its authority was met with resistance.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Mexico wasn't blind to what was happening.
Okay.
They saw the influx of slaves, the blatant disregard for their laws.
Right.
And so they sent officials to investigate.
Okay.
One in particular was Colonel Jose de las Piedras.
Okay.
And, even he had to admit the obvious. He said, and this is a quote, "The colony of Mr. Austin was born thanks to slavery, and without it, it would be nothing."
Wow. Talk about hitting the nail on the head. So what could they even do at that point?
Well, they tried to compromise,
Oh, eh?
tried to find a middle ground that might appease both sides.
Okay.
And you remember Article 13 of the Mexican Constitution?
Yeah, the one that caused so much friction.
Exactly, the one aimed at abolishing slavery. Well, it was revised.
So they didn't completely scrap it. What did this revised version look like?
It was a more moderate approach.
Okay.
It focused on what they called freedom of the womb.
Okay.
Essentially, while existing slaves remained enslaved, any children born in Mexican Texas would be free.
Okay, so it's kind of a step towards gradual emancipation.
Right.
It's a compromise, but it still protects the economic interests of the slave owners to some extent.
That's right.
Did it quell the unrest?
Not even close.
Really?
No, in fact, figures like Stephen Austin saw it as an opportunity,
Okay.
as a crack in the door that they could pry open further.
This guy never missed a chance to kind of push his agenda, did he? What was his next move?
Well, he argued that even this limited form of emancipation, this freedom of the womb, was actually detrimental.
Wait, how could he possibly spin that? I'm almost afraid to ask.
Well, he and his brother, James Elijah Brown Austin,
Okay.
they claimed that enslaved people needed to be trained for freedom,
Okay.
prepared for the responsibilities of a free life.
Right.
And they went so far as to propose raising the age of emancipation to 25,
Wow.
claiming it would benefit those they enslaved by giving them more time to learn these essential skills.
It's incredible how they twisted the narrative to fit their own agenda. They were basically saying that slavery, in their own, enlightened version, was a necessary stepping stone to freedom.
It really illustrates how insidious these pro-slavery arguments could be.
Yeah.
They were masters at manipulating language,
Yeah.
cloaking self-interest in this veneer of benevolence, and it's a tactic, sadly, we still see used today, often to justify inequality and maintain power structures.
It's a sobering thought for sure. So while Mexico is trying to find a peaceful resolution here, we have these powerful figures within the Anglo-American community
Yeah.
actively undermining those efforts
Yes.
and pushing for a different outcome altogether.
Yeah.
Things are really heating up now.
They are.
And I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's just it's kind of mind-blowing to think about those arguments, like being used back then.
Yeah.
To say that enslaved people needed more time enslaved to be ready for freedom, like, wow. That's
It's something else.
Yeah, it just boggles the mind.
It does. It really does. But that was the reality of the situation, right?
Yeah.
These justifications, as absurd as they seem to us today, they were a fundamental part of this system that they were fighting to uphold.
Okay, yeah.
And it's really crucial to remember that context.
Right.
As we examine everything that happens next, right? The Texas Revolution, it wasn't just some like minor squabble over taxes or local governance.
Right.
This was about the very soul of a nation, about who got to define freedom.
Right.
And most importantly, for whom.
Okay, so we're talking about this clash of cultures, conflicting ideologies, this deep-seated belief in the necessity of slavery.
Right.
On the part of so many of these Anglo-American settlers.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did this all, how did this culminate in the Texas Revolution that, we read about in our history books?
Well, it's not an overnight thing, right? It's these tensions that we've been talking about, they simmer for years, fueled by, events like the Fredonian Rebellion.
The Fredonian Rebellion. Tell me more about that. It always seemed like kind of a footnote.
Yeah.
In the larger story of Texas independence.
Right. It often gets overshadowed by the Alamo.
Yeah.
But it was a pivotal moment, really.
Okay.
So 1826, we have Hayden Edwards.
Okay.
Who was, he was a brash and ambitious impresario.
Okay.
He declares a small patch of East Texas independent from Mexico.
Wait, so we're talking about an actual, a revolt.
Yeah.
What was the main driving force behind that?
A combination of things. Really, Edwards was furious over these land grant disputes.
Right.
And he very shrewdly tapped into, this growing resentment towards the Mexican government among Anglo settlers.
Okay.
But I think at its core, the Fredonian Rebellion, and it was short-lived, but it really exposed the fault lines that would eventually erupt into this much larger Texas Revolution.
So it was kind of like a little taste of what was to come.
Exactly, yeah. A preview of the bigger conflict.
A little sneak peek.
And, the rebellion's eventually put down, but it was a wake-up call.
Okay.
Both for the Mexican government and for those pushing for Texas independence.
Right.
It showed just how deep the divisions ran.
Right.
And it emboldened those who wanted to break away from Mexican rule.
So we've gone way beyond the Alamo.
Yeah.
Beyond, the textbook version of Texas independence.
Right.
And uncovered something far more complex.
Right.
And frankly, a little unsettling.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a fight for, freedom and liberty.
It wasn't that simple.
It was a fight to maintain a system that was built on the backs of enslaved people.
That's right.
A system that many, many Anglo-American settlers just saw as essential to their way of life.
He did.
Even if it meant defying the laws of their adopted nation.
And it reminds us that history is rarely simple or one-sided, right?
Yeah.
It's messy.
Yeah.
It's complicated, and it's full of contradictions.
Absolutely.
And by digging a little bit deeper, challenging these dominant narratives, that's how we gain this much richer and, I think, more nuanced understanding of the past.
And hopefully a better appreciation for how complex the present really is.
I think so.
That's all the time we have for today, but, the conversation doesn't end here.
Keep exploring. Keep questioning.
Exactly. Keep asking questions and never stop learning, guys.
Absolutely.
Until next time.
Don't know.